Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Todd Leventhal, who has over 25 years experience in countering Russian, Soviet, Iraqi, and other disinformation, conspiracy theories, and false stories, mainly for the U.S. Information Agency and the U.S. Department of State. He retired from U.S. government service in May 2018 and served as a senior counter-disinformation advisor in the Russian division of the State Department's Global Engagement Center, or GEC, from late 2018 to April 2022. Todd Leventhal, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks very much.
The conversation I'd like to have with you today, Todd, will cover a recent article you wrote entitled "The Need to Up Our Game in Countering Disinformation." And we looking forward to chatting with you about that. But before we get into this topic, could we start by getting your overall assessment of our strategic landscape?
What do you mean by that?
Well, I guess I'm just looking to get your general comment about the times that we live in today.
Well, I think the thing that dominates right now is the war, Russia's aggressive war against Ukraine, which will be, I'm sure, one of the most important wars of this century. So I think a lot of it depends on the outcome of that war. And we and NATO countries are supplying the Ukrainians, but the Russians are very close by. So it remains to be seen what will happen. Yeah, but that's a hugely important event that's going on right now.
Sure, yeah. So we're going to be talking about disinformation and countering disinformation. I think it's always helpful to define what's meant by the term disinformation. And given your long tenure working on this kind of a challenge, I think you've got an unusually rich perspective on this topic. So how do you define disinformation? And could you also give some historical context, especially as the term or the concept has become more prevalent in our current discourse?
Yeah, well, it's a Russian term, desinformatia. And it simply means deliberate lies. And you can be contrasted with misinformation, which is unintentional mistakes. You know, you can open a newspaper, and if there's a breaking event, sometimes things are uncertain. They don't know how many people died in an accident, or you don't know why it happened. And there can be mistakes made in journalism or anybody else trying to comment on something that happened recently before things become clear. So that's relatively benign. There's no evil intent. With disinformation, there's an intent to deceive and to harm. So this is a standard tool that the Soviets and the Russians have used for decades, part of their toolbook, and it's a real problem.
Yeah, not to be too silly about this, but could you also explain, in your words, why is disinformation a problem? And I'm not trying to be, silly here, but legitimately, why is it a problem?
It's a problem because, if a foreign power, in this case Russia, or in the past the Soviet Union, decides to make up false stories to discredit the United States or whoever they're opposed to, this creates a problem for us. For example, there was a story a false story that they started spreading, years ago, that the U.S. had created the virus that causes AIDS. This was the most famous Soviet disinformation story from the 1980s. I mean, when AIDS first appeared, nobody knew where it came from. Now we know it, probably emerged in Central Africa 50, 60 years ago. The scientists have traced this, but at the time, it's a huge mystery. So people were upset, they were distraught, and some people naturally form conspiracy theory and say, "Oh, it must be the government trying to harm us." And there was, in fact, in the gay community in New York and elsewhere, there were suspicions that this was, the government was trying to harm them and created this weapon to harm people who are homosexuals. Not true at all, but a suspicion. And suspicions are a normal part of human behavior. Well, the Russians saw this, or the Soviets, I should say, saw this, and they picked up on it. And then they created a story that, the United States government created it at Fort Detrick, which was where our biological defense research occurs in Maryland. And this spread to the nearest closest big city, which was New York. Of course, there's other big cities that are much closer to Fort Detrick, which is in Maryland. Washington, D.C. is close, Baltimore, Philadelphia. But AIDS had first been noticed in New York City. So they created this cock and bull story that it was created at Fort Detrick and it spread to New York because it was supposedly close. And then it went from there. So people all over the world, and then they spread it through TASS and Novosti, their news agencies. All over the world, you had this story was picked up by the press. And some people, I'm sure, believed it. So that can do tremendous harm to our country when we're falsely accused of doing horrible, horrible things. And that's standard operating procedure for the Soviets and now the Russians.
Right. And correct me if I'm wrong, but your career tended to be like more outward looking or more outward focus from the homeland of the U.S. Would you say
Yes,
that that's correct?
I worked for the United States Information Agency, which was focused on foreign countries, just like the State Department is focused on foreign countries. So we wouldn't aim our communications at domestic audiences. We would aim them at countries, at publics overseas. That was our mission. So, it was exclusively aimed at foreign countries, although sometimes journalists would be interested in this stuff and would talk to us.
Right.
But that was not our focus. Our focus overseas oriented.
Right. Okay. Yes. And also for the comments that you were just making a moment ago about the AIDS disinformation, certainly there's a domestic component of that.
Yes.
where U.S. citizens are consuming this information, and that's having an effect.
Yes.
And abroad, that same kind of disinformation taints attitudes globally that are detrimental to the U.S. in this case as well.
Yes, absolutely. And this is a tricky part because you're absolutely right. These stories can have an effect domestically, both in their origin being, thought up by people here who have suspicions, inordinate suspicions, and are affected also by Russian or Soviet stories. But our focus was overseas, not domestic. Now, State Department has a overseas and a domestic mission to the public affairs. So they can do both. But when I was working at the old USIA, which was absorbed into the State Department in 1999, I should say, but I was working in the 80s and the 90s, we were focused overseas.
I see. Okay, so you talked about AIDS just a moment ago. What are some of the other things that are big disinformation themes that you could review for our audience?
Sure.
And so I mean, people may or may not be aware of these, but these were big deals when they were unfolding.
Yeah, the one thing I worked on, like from the first week I got there, was a child organ trafficking rumor, which started in Latin America, in Honduras and Guatemala, and spread worldwide. This is a false story that says Americans or sometimes other nationalities are going down to Latin America, adopting or kidnapping children, bringing them back to the States, and then using them, killing them to use in organ transplants to save their natural born children who have some sort of medical defect. Now, this is
this 1980s again.
Started in 1987.
Okay, and perhaps it still persists to this
It
day.
does.
Yeah, various
Variation.
different iterations. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it went like wildfire through the world press in 87 and 96. It actually wound up a variation of the rumor that claimed corneas were being stolen, won the most prestigious journalism prizes in France in 95 and in Spain in 96. This was crazy. This is a false story, but it appeals to people's suspicions and fears around organ transplantation. Now, organ transplantation is more routine, but in the 80s, it had just started. There were drugs to suppress the immune system that made it possible. Before that, you get an organ from someone else and your body naturally rejects it. But once these drugs were developed, this became more common. And then you had fears that, oh, somebody's going to steal my organs, or somebody else is going to do that. So this was a natural fear. And this story, I say, was just unbelievable the way it spread. And I wrote a long report to the United Nations on it in 1994, 40-page report, because they were giving it. There was a special rapporteur at the UN who was giving it credence. People would hear these stories and they'd say, ain't it awful? Let's do something about this. Well, the stories were not true, but people believed them, so they had an impact. So now that after it sort of ran its course, you don't see that specific rumor anymore, but you see stories like in Ukraine that claim falsely that, the Ukrainians are trying to use corpses from Russians killed, for transplants in Ukraine. But that's like a local story. It hasn't gone international. But you still see that kind of crazy story popping up because that's a primal fear, body integrity, that a lot of these things relate to primal fears we have.
Right. And yeah, so this is not a political podcast, but some of these topics, it's challenging to talk about them without brushing up against some like live discourse that's happening within the U.S. right now. But yeah, the whole child or eating children and stuff like that comes right to the kinds of things that are rattling around in our presidential discourse over the last few years.
You can have conspiracy theories that circulate on their own or in certain subgroups of the population, and quite often what the Russians will do is they'll watch what people are saying in our country, and they'll pick up anything that might be useful for them, and they'll circulate it. So these rumors, these organ trafficking rumors, are circulating not domestically, but overseas. And the Russians picked up on those. They didn't invent them, but they repeated them and spread them much further.
Amazing. So we touched base before we recorded, Todd, and you mentioned to me that there's other disinformation projects or things that you tackled over the years. Everything related from uranium to things related to Gorbachev to Iraqi propaganda. What was the Iraqi propaganda that?
Well, that was during the 1991 Gulf War. I took the lead for the U.S. government at that time in countering Iraqi propaganda and disinformation. I sent out a cable to all our posts overseas, asking them to report to us back in Washington stuff in the local press, and we had people within the U.S. government who were monitoring what the Iraqis were saying. So I had all this information flowing in, and I summarized it and I would speak to the press about it. At one time, in February, the war started in January, so I would speak. The U.S. Information Agency had what they called WorldNet, which was basically televised press conferences. So you usually do it with some expert. But the big story back then was Iraqi propaganda and disinformation. While you remember there was a war went on for about 6 weeks or so, and there was a lot of bombing and whatnot before the troops got involved back in '91, the ground forces. So there was a lot of stuff going on in the press. So they had embassies from all over the world would invite the local press. You'd have embassies in, say, French-speaking countries in West Africa. You do a broadcast to them, and you'd get 3 or 4 or 5 embassies. They'd invite the local press to the embassy, and I'd answer questions. I'd talk briefly about this subject, then I'd answer questions, and then they'd have video or audio material they could use in that press on this topic. So I did, I think, 8 or 9 world nets with all different parts of the world, in all different areas, and the International Press Corps in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, did hour and a half session with them. So, USIA had a very good way to get the word out to key journalists in countries overseas, because the press officers, our press officers, would have relationships, of course, with the local press. And, they knew them well. And this is the one way you could get the word out.
Right. Famously, there's various different versions of the saying. The truth is always playing catch up to lies. Lie can travel around the world faster than the truth can. All these kinds of things. So, using that as let's just say that there's something to that. But what are some of the successful tactics that you and your colleagues have either employed or discovered, and what are some unsuccessful ways of addressing these kinds of challenges?
Well, the main thing you have to do is you have to learn everything you can about a subject. So you have to have complete mastery of the subject material from total immersion in the raw data. And then, of course, if there's a question that can be answered by somebody in authority, you go to them. For example, with the baby part story, I went down to United Network for Organ Sharing. This is a group in Richmond that coordinates organ donations with transplantation. And they have, there's a lot of transplant surgeons they know, and they explained to me the extremely complex process that goes into organ transplantation. You can't just do it clandestinely in some back alley like people were claiming. So I would simply summarize what they told me, make sure it was correct, and you use that information to explain to people, look, this can't happen. It's too complex. You may think it can happen, but it can't. There was a woman who was attacked in Latin America, down in Guatemala. They thought she had a child had disappeared at an Easter celebration, gotten lost momentarily. And the woman believed, well, the gringa, this American woman, stole my child because she had read these articles about organ transplantation. So, and she was attacked and beaten to within an inch of her life. It was terrible. Mm. But you simply, one of the things you do is you point out the harm that these false rumors can do. It's not only that they're false, they have terrible consequences. In this case, she was attacked, other Americans were attacked, people in other countries were killed because of these unwarranted suspicions. Organ trafficking, organ donations went down in some countries, which meant people died because they couldn't get an organ for transplant. And inter-country adoptions went down because people were afraid, they're going to adopt my kid and you cut them up for organ transplants. There was even a form in Romania 1988, that said, I agree that I will not do this. Well, this is a whole nonsense thing, but the fears, spread very far. So you talk to people who are authorities, you show the harm that these things can do, you show how they're not true, and in some cases, you explain why people think crazy things. For example, after the 1991 Gulf War, we used depleted uranium ammunition for the first time. And this is, like if you enrich uranium for a power plant, you try to take the most radioactive parts of natural occurring uranium and concentrate these. And what you have left over is, it's not very radioactive, but it's a waste product. But it turns out that this is very good for ammunition to kill tanks, because depleted uranium is very heavy. It's almost twice as heavy as lead, if you can imagine. Mm. So if you fire this at a tank, it hits it, and the depleted uranium round tends to be self-sharpening. It doesn't, the front of it, the tip doesn't go splat. It actually gets sharper as the parts of it get burned away, and wow. It's pyrophoric. Yeah. It explodes. Once the gets inside a tank, it spontaneously creates an explosion, kills the tank. So it's great for tank ammunition. We used it A-10 attacked aircrafts, and some tanks would fire depleted uranium rounds at Iraqi tanks. But the false story that went out was this was causing birth defects and cancer in Iraq. And there was no evidence for this. Mm. But of course, it's easy to make a false claim, and people are scared of uranium. But all the studies that were done, I went through all the studies by European Union, NATO, different organizations. They found no evidence for any of this. But also, people don't automatically believe that. And I was thinking about it, I said, well, why don't they believe this? It's because of the unconscious fears we have about anything with the name uranium. Because what do you think of when you think of uranium? I think of, atomic bomb, Hiroshima, radioactive fallout, birth defects, cancer, because these were caused by,
Yeah, and I even start thinking about like sci-fi stuff as well.
Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
Exactly.
It goes to the root of something deep within our
exactly.
our
and
fear
these
centers.
Are mostly a lot of subconscious fears and associations. So what I just realized I had to do is I had to talk about that. I couldn't just say it's not. Look, this group found it's not harmful. This group found it's not, because people would disbelieve it. So you had to address the reason why they were disbelieving it were these unconscious or subconscious associations. And once you explain that, you could get a cognitive opening, and people would say, all right, yeah, I do have those associations. I'm sure they're coloring my thinking, but tell me the fact. What are the facts? So you had to understand how the mind works. And, the mind doesn't always work perfectly. We're not perfectly rational creatures. We're prone to conspiracy theories. And there's organ trafficking rumors. They're conspiracy theory, where you think some evil force is victimizing innocents. So that's one of the ways you do this, is you explain the irrational ways people form beliefs, and you can get them to examine that, and then you can introduce facts as well. So facts by themselves are not 100% foolproof, because we don't always reason. We're not like Mr. Spock on Star Trek. We're not 100% rational.
Right. Does there also need to be a cultural awareness, or like in-depth knowledge of the specific, or like even the micro culture that you're targeting, in order to also make that kind of counter messaging more
attuned,
effective?
Yes. I mean, to the extent that you have it. You're sitting here in Washington, you got a lot of facts coming in. You don't understand everything, but you can make the big distinctions. But you have to work to worldwide audiences also for stuff that spreads worldwide.
Right.
So you do the best you can to tailor it, but you can't always do that, with 100% as much as you'd want to.
Right, right. I should have asked this probably about 10 minutes ago, Todd, but I'll circle back to it now and touch upon this. You're also an expert in active measures, and we'll have a link to an extensive testimony or report to Congress from the early 1990s that you were part of creating. But could you, well, first give just like a very quick 101 on what active measures are, and also how does disinformation integrate with active measures?
Sure. Active measures is a KGB term that they used, which meant covert influence operations. And when we were starting to look at this, we being the US government, back in the 1970s, and of course, there were defectors who came out and told us about this. So the intelligence community had a very good understanding of this, and they helped spread that through congressional testimony through the entire government. But basically, it's a term that was a KGB term for covert influence operations that they took under false, they'd say, like they set up a newspaper in India called The Patriot. Now, this was run by KGB, and this was where the AIDS disinformation story first appeared. But it didn't say KGB or Soviet Union on it, just said The Patriot, English language newspaper. So people who had studied this knew it was KGB's founded and controlled, but other people wouldn't. So you'd have something that appears to be independent, but it's really run by the Soviets behind the scenes. So that's the covert aspect. And disinformation is one of the techniques. Of course, I've always said that the Soviets and now the Russians, they're so unscrupulous, they'll even use true information if it serves their purposes. It doesn't have to be false. In fact, it's nice if it's true, if they can find compromising information through hacking into our systems and release that publicly. That's not disinformation. They call it hack and leak. They have a term directed information, which we don't use, but that's part of their techniques as well. Or just covert propaganda. It doesn't have to be a lie. It can be just saying, an opinion. Propaganda is more about an opinion rather than a fact. Like the theme would be the U.S. is a bully. Okay. Some people are going to believe that. Some people are not going to believe that. You can't ever say it's totally true or totally false. A lot of it's in the mind of the person who receives that message. So if they covertly spread propaganda, doesn't say it's from the Russians, pretends to be from an independent source, that's one of their techniques. So right. Covert propaganda, disinformation, hack and leak type true information. And it's very interesting. The practitioners before this whole electronic era, they would review, the KGB would steal Western documents, of course. And they would review the active measures, people, and they would use them if they were useful for their purposes. So active measures, an old KGB term, they stopped using it in 1992. They changed the term to measures of support for Soviet foreign policy. But active measures was a term that included disinformation and these other techniques undertaken by KGB. But when the U.S. government analyzed it, they looked at not just what KGB was doing, but also propaganda organs and front groups and whatnot. So it's a term of art. It's not a common term. People sort of know what disinformation means. Active measures, people don't know. It's a very anodyne term.
I see.
Not apparent what it means except to experts.
I see. Also, I think maybe in this same kind of like a thought space, or talking about former Soviet terms. Something else that's come up on this podcast a few times has been the Soviet technique of reflexive control. Do you think you could just briefly contrast reflexive control with active measures, or do you consider them to be somewhat synonymous?
I think, well, I don't think reflexive control, they certainly use that term, but I think it's not used very much to
I
my
see.
extent.
I see.
I think it was more of a, I'm not sure if it was just a military term or whatever, military intelligence service, they may have different terms, but certainly it's not widespread. People focus on it because it sounds like, oh, they know how to control me, but it's the same basic techniques. The mind works in different irrational ways, and they know how to manipulate us. I mean, that's their specialty. So of course, but they don't have a magic wand that they can control people, but they try to influence them.
I see. Okay. Well, I'd like to start touching on your article that we mentioned at the top. And so, you've spent a lot of time with the Department of State, but here, like most recently in the last, I guess, 3 or 4 years or so, you were intimately involved in the Global Engagement Center. So well, maybe you could just give just a quick, again, I keep on going back to like a quick 101 on what the Global Engagement Center is, but then I'd like to get some of your observations from this time at the Global Engagement Center, and again, what were some of the major takeaways from your article, and we'll have a link to that in the show notes.
Sure. Yeah, Global Engagement Center was focused on messaging to potential violent extremists to try to convince them not to join the jihad, not to be violent against the United States or our allies. This was the original mission back in 2010 when it was first formed. And I was one of the original 7 members of the Global Engagement Center. There's a predecessor organization, but this was a new mission at this time. And then at the end of 2016, 6 years later, it also got the mission of countering disinformation, which, coincidentally, I had done that for, at that point, close to 20 years, all through I started in 1987 through 1996 at USIA. I got sent to the Voice of America in a reduction in force. I came back to, now it was State Department in 2002 and did it throughout the 2000s. And I joined Global Engagement Center when it started. And I was focused the first few years, as everyone there was, how do we prevent these people from joining the jihad? And then we got the new mission of countering state-sponsored disinformation in 2016. So I was transferred over to work on that. And, these are challenging, especially how do you prevent people from joining the jihad? This is a very challenging mission. This is not something that is routine for people in the U.S. government. It's more about communicating what the United States is all about, our values, our culture in the old USA, or our policies. So this is a much more complex issue. But that was fascinating. But that's sort of a separate topic from what we're talking about today.
Okay, yeah.
And then, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine and their illegal annexation of Crimea in 2013, wasn't it? No, 2014. It was after the March 2014. Then people sort of woke up and said, yeah, we should do something about Russian disinformation. And I had, of course, worked this issue for many, many years, Soviet disinformation and other false stories. So I was tapped to form a small, at that time, counter disinformation team in 2015, not in GEC. I was detailed out of GEC to another bureau to do this. And then we had about 30 articles for a website we were about to launch, because a website's the best way to get attention on this, and it was killed. The whole project was killed by Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, Richard Stengel, without explanation. My bosses ask, what's the problem? I've got problems with what are the problems? Never explained what the problems were. My speculation, I don't know this for a fact,
Okay. Yeah.
but this happened right after the Russians went into Syria. And after the Russians had gone into Crimea, we had sort of frozen them out diplomatically. One of the ways we were reacting to their aggression. But after they went into Syria, where we were working against ISIS, there's a need to communicate, to deconflict, to make sure that what we're doing, they know what we're doing, and vice versa, so we don't mistakenly run into each other and have an accident with the casualties. So my speculation is that people saw there was a new need to communicate with the Russians to break the diplomatic freeze, and they were afraid, not for good reason, in my opinion, but it's a norm. People think that if we talk, the attitude is, well, they can spread lies about us 24/7, but if we point out a few of their lies, oh my God, maybe they won't talk to us. Well, they'll talk to us. We talk to them even though they spread disinformation about us, and they're not the belle of the ball. They're not going to be all upset about this. They'll complain about it, but they'll talk to us on serious stuff.
Right.
But some people.
If I could interject here, so to our audience, Todd and I talked about this briefly before we started recording, but do you think you could shine a light on the difference between public diplomacy and private diplomacy? I think that might be a good.
It's a very good point.
Yeah.
Because what we're talking about, what State Department does, talking to the Russians, that's private diplomacy, government to government. And it's behind closed doors, and you can discuss things frankly that you might not necessarily want to have just revealed in privately. It's just let's keep things private. Public diplomacy, which what USIA did and what Global Engagement Center is doing, is communicating to the press and to publics overseas through the press about things that are important for the U.S. government, including disinformation.
And so
there's a tension between the two, because people who are concerned with private diplomacy, they tend to be not to want anything to interfere. And they're worried that if you say something public, it's going to interfere. I have a different opinion. My opinion is you say something publicly, they'll pay attention to that. And it's good. It'll help us. But there's a fear among professional diplomats that public diplomacy will screw things up, make it more difficult. And it may make it more difficult, but I don't think it's going to screw things up. So my speculation is that the project was killed because, we needed to talk to the Russians. We hadn't been talking to them for a year, and they were worried that calling them out on false story was just going to somehow interfere. I don't think it would have. The Russians respect strength, and they don't respect weakness. To them, weakness is provocative. If you roll over, if you play it quiet, they'll roll right over you. If you stand up to them, they'll take that into account. They'll either stand down or back down, or they won't be as aggressive. But that's my opinion. I've seen that work. But a lot of professional diplomats at State Department have a different point of view. So that I don't know that's the reason, but that's my speculation as to why the website was killed.
I see.
And then a couple of years, a year or so later, the Hill, Congress got involved. They said, what are you guys doing to counter Russian disinformation? Well, not a lot. So then they said, we'll give it to the Global Engagement Center, this mission. So, that's good, but it would have been better if they let the small project I was working on go forward, because I was in charge of it. I had, all these years of experience. I knew what I was doing. I would have done it right. You give it to the Global Engagement Center. You got quite frankly, I was the only one in the U.S. government who had any experience doing this. In the 80s, we had people all over the government, a couple of people here, a couple of people there involved in this. That all went away when the Soviet Union went away. I was the only one who continued, not countering Russian disinformation, but any false story that was of concern to any embassy around the world. And, I was busy. There was always something to do. Whether it's organ trafficking rumors or depleted uranium or 9/11 conspiracy theories, that was huge overseas. So, I had experience in doing this. I knew what to do. It would have been better to do it small, start small with, highly competent people and build out rather than throwing a lot of money at people who didn't have any experience in this area. But that's what was done.
Right. Your article suggests, or I guess it's not a suggestion, it's an overt assertion that we need to up our game relative to countering disinformation. Could you make that case?
Yeah, I think the problem is when USIA, U.S. Information Agency, was absorbed into State Department in 1999, that created a structural conflict between public diplomacy and private diplomacy. The ideal case for private diplomacy is don't ruffle anybody's feathers, don't say anything publicly, let's just deal with other governments. That's the way to get things done. And all that stuff's very important. But it was better to have that function in the State Department and the public diplomacy function in a separate agency, USIA. When you put them in the same organization, you get an inherent conflict, and private diplomacy tends to trump public diplomacy, not 100% of the time, but that's just the reality. It's the organizational culture of the State Department not to want to make a stink about false stories publicly. Whereas making a stink about them is how we actually got the Russians to stop crude anti-American disinformation in their press in the 80s because we made a huge stink about it. At the same time that they wanted a good image. It was a larger issue. They had realized they'd lost the Cold War with Reagan in power, Strategic Defense Initiative. We were outclassing them militarily, and they had to somehow try to stop that. And they did it. Their main slogan was, let's eliminate the enemy image. Because if you say the Soviet Union is not a threat, then what do you need all these weapons for? And they wanted us to stop the military modernization that was going on under the Reagan administration and the other staunch policies. So they became hyper conciliatory, which again and that's an influence operation. But it's not disinformation per se. Well, it is in a way, but disinformation doesn't have to be nasty. It can be nice. Soviet Union is not a threat. That's disinformation. It's conciliatory disinformation. So I wrote a report to Congress in '92 analyzing all this. But you have to deal with all these things, and the best place to deal with them was in old USIA. Now, what I would recommend now, you can't recreate USIA. You can make fish into fish soup, but you can't go in the other direction. You can't.
Okay.
Once it's done, it's done. So I don't think you can extract USIA from State Department. But you could create an NGO that could be federally funded or privately funded with experts, just a few people who have access to all the good information and can speak publicly without fear of being, they wouldn't have to clear it with the State Department. And I think that would be the way to go forward. I don't think you can go backward. We had a great system before 1999. I don't think you can go back there, but you can go forward where you get the best of both worlds where, let State Department do their thing, that's fine, but also create a public-facing agency that communicates to the publics on this issue.
Yeah, that's a interesting concept, Todd, about having like an NGO or some organization which obviously has a relationship with the State Department, but is otherwise independent and has this charter to be able to communicate freely, like you've been describing. I can imagine that there are people who are familiar with this entire dynamic that would be opposed to that kind of a suggestion. Do you think you could take just a moment and try to articulate what would be like some of the thoughtful objections to that kind of a initiative going forward?
Yeah, well, my concept would be that they didn't have a relationship with State Department.
Oh, okay, all right. Then
they'd be independent.
Sorry to mischaracterize that. Okay.
Because they don't need it.
Uh-huh.
But basically, that suggestion is, I put it forward in an article, but it's not like it's been discussed publicly. But the basic problem, one of the basic problems people have with disinformation is the whole question of protected speech in the United States. We've seen this come up. Where what happens? It's one thing if the foreign power is spreading a false story. Okay, that's fairly clear. You want to protect against that. But what happens when people in the United States are essentially spreading disinformation? And that's a highly sensitive issue, and it's a unavoidable conundrum. And it's even in the Washington Post today is along these lines. And I think the way to finesse that is to focus on foreign communications, because once you start to try to adjudicate, well, this is disinformation, and that's not within the United States, that's a rat's nest, it's a hornet's nest of just gets you into deeper and deeper problems. Because there are idiots, in every country in the world. There are people here in every country in the world that believe crazy things, including stuff that's objectively speaking disinformation. But it works best if we can tie it to a foreign power and stay out of the domestic debate. And that's what sunk some of these previous efforts. People thought there was going to be government censorship, which, it's impossible in this country. You can't have government censorship. We don't have that kind of power. The government doesn't. There's a very vibrant free press. So nothing like that would ever happen. But people have this fear that it would happen. So they're hypersensitive to it.
I see. Not to put you on the spot here, Todd, but you seem to be a fellow who is not, who is, speaks his mind. So who are the kinds of people that who get it, right? Who understand what needs to be done, who you think have a good outlook, and like if you could put together like a dream team, who would be the kinds of people that would be on a dream team for something like this?
Well, mostly they're in Europe. And I would say Jakub Kalinski. He's with the Hybrid Center of Excellence, EU Hybrid Center of Excellence in Helsinki now. But he was with the EU, the European Union had an EU versus disinformation website. It's launched in 2015. Just at the same time we were about to launch our website that got killed, they launched their website, and he's the one who came up with that, invented that basically. So he's good. And then, there's other people in Europe who work this issue. But there's a guy named Jakub Janda in Czech Republic, runs the European Values think tank. He knows everybody who's anybody on this issue. So there's a lot of people in Europe doing it. The United States, it's more difficult because you've got some people, there's a lot of Johnny-come-latelys to this issue. There's a lot of people who, I was very lucky to have started working this issue 36 years ago, 1987. So I've got a lot of historical experience and memory. A lot of the people came to this after the presidential election of 2016, when there was Russian interference trying to get Trump elected. So, and by the way, just to say, I don't think they had a decisive influence. I think actually the Comey, the FBI director, had a decisive influence when he reopened the investigation. So it's not foreign influence. It was his sense of propriety that interfered in the election, in my opinion, because the polls had Clinton up, and then she tanked after he came out with reopened the investigation of the emails.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think we can blame the Russians. Wanted to do all they could to get Trump elected, but I don't think their influence was significant.
I see.
But a lot of people got into the game after that, and they overwhelmingly looked at social media, even though social media is only one aspect of it. But that was given a lot of publicity when Facebook and other social media companies were, they knew stuff was coming from Russia. They were being paid in rubles. So they could say, yes, these are the accounts that are actually Russian, but they pretend to be American. And they gave that to the Senate, I think it was Foreign Relations Committee, which released it publicly. So a lot of people got stuck on the idea that it was all about social media, whereas it's much broader than that. And regular media is important. Any way to communicate is important. Orally, written, regular media, all that stuff, social media, yes, of course. Social media makes it much easier to penetrate an adversary's communications information space. But a lot of these people didn't have the background that I had, and I learned from some of the best in the 1980s. My boss, Herb Romerstein, knew a lot about this, and the intelligence community knew a lot about it from defectors, and they produced some excellent studies in 1980 and 1982 that, laid it all out. So I've been working this issue for many years, and a lot of the people domestically haven't. But a lot of the people I would choose would be from overseas.
I see. Well, I think that's probably a great spot to leave off. You've certainly given us a lot to think about, Todd. And with that, Todd Leventhal, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Yeah, thank you very much. Great initiative. I appreciate the invitation.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.